Thank you to Scott Slovic, Melissa Wall, Winifred Poster, and Alexandra Moore, the first roundtable of the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies, which we inked into existence in November, basically as an inaugural event. And Scott spoke on this occasion on this chair as a theme on environment and precarity in January. The chair's mandate is actually a teaching and research unit. So it's not the usual UNESCO thing of grassroots work and democracy and the kind of work they normally do. It's designed and approved as a teaching and research unit. We are mandated to offer courses and programs, conduct research, do the usual publications, and organize talks. We thought we should start off by conceptualizing vulnerability in the sense that we often find people using vulnerability and precarity interchangeably. Vulnerability has become a more or less catchword in terms of information sciences, cultural heritage preservation debates, education, much of critical theory, of course. And it has occurred as a shorthand to speak about economic and financial, but also geospatial instabilities. It has informed debates about sociocultural relations. And we know the work that all of you have done. Melissa's work on Syrian refugees and information vulnerability, Scott's huge corpus of work on environmentalism and disaster and literature, Winifred Poster's work on information and information ethos and cultures and ethics. What we thought we should do before we embark on ambitious teaching programs or short-term courses in this is to think in definitional terms. And the idea that we bring together people from multiple disciplines to speak about it, bringing your different areas of expertise, your approaches and perspectives to bear upon how we could possibly define vulnerability. So we have next week, Lisa Diedrich speaking on medicine, culture, disease, and vulnerability. We have somebody from the World Bank who does quantitative work on quantifying vulnerability. The purpose, as I said, is to think in terms of defining it, but also perhaps preparing a roadmap for us as to how we could take this forward for teaching programs across the country, but perhaps maybe in terms of open educational resources. So we hope to capitalize upon this in terms of both clarity and cooperation eventually from several of the speakers today and others. The chair's original proposal listed about 10 to 15 people who are part of potentially a part of the team who gave us letters of endorsements. Scott was one of them, that they would be happy to cooperate and collaborate with the chair. We have subsequently, this is just as an update, received queries for collaboration from a couple of Indian universities and colleges to organize talks and courses. So we are working towards those. So that's the very brief agenda for our roundtable, split into two, given time zones and things like that. I'll now hand this over to our project assistant, Meenakshi Srihari, whom you saw briefly trying to sort out link problems and recording problems. Our other project assistant is also here, Atul Nair. Please meet the other faculty fellows. Anna Kurian, whom you met. She is a professor in the Department of English, specializing in Shakespeare studies, young adult literature. Dr. Zaidul Haq from the Department of Urdu, specializing in 18th century Urdu poetry. Sharadindu Bhattacharya, whose interests are in trauma studies, young adult fiction, and fantasy. Meenakshi, would you take over now and introduce them, the speakers to each other, please? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I will now introduce the speakers for in today's roundtable, the first session of today's roundtable. Let me begin by introducing Professor Melissa Wall. Professor Melissa Wall teaches in the Department of Journalism at the California State University Northridge, where she works on citizen participatory journalism. She is the editor of the book Citizen Journalism Practices Propaganda Pedagogy, published by Routledge 2019, and is the creator of Pop Up Newsroom, which is a temporary virtual newsroom for citizen and student journalists. Her research has been published in journals such as New Media and Society, Journalism, Media Culture and Society, Digital Journalism, Journalism Studies, and the Journal of Communication Inquiry. We are also joined by Professor Scott Slovic. Professor Slovic also joined us for a talk earlier this year under the aegis of the UNESCO chair. He is the University Distinguished Professor of Environmental Humanities at the University of Idaho. He is the co-editor, more recently, of works such as the Bloomsbury Handbook to the Medical Environmental Humanities, Nature and Literary Studies, and the Routledge Handbook of Eco-Criticism and Environmental Communication. His monographs include Going Away to Think, Engagement, Retreat, and Eco-Critical Responsibility, and Seeking Awareness in American Nature Writing. The founding president of the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment, ASLE, he edited the journal ISLE, Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and Environment, from 1995 to 2020. Our final speaker today is Professor Winifred Poster. Trained as a sociologist from Stanford and UC Berkeley, Winifred Poster currently teaches at the Washington University, St. Louis, where she works on feminist labor theory, digital globalization, and Indian outsourcing, with a focus on the intersection of post colonial computing with the political economy of service labor. She has held visiting positions at the University of Hyderabad in India, the University of Paderborn in Germany, the University of Toronto in Canada, and the Intel Science and Technology Center for Social Computing at UC Irvine. Her work has appeared in journals such as the American Sociological Review, Social Problems, Gender and Society, International Journal of Politics, Culture and Society, and the Journal of Developing Societies. We are so happy to have such an esteemed panel of speakers today at this roundtable. Uh, this ends the round of introductions. If you're ready to start off the presentations, we could perhaps begin with Professor Melissa Wall.
So, I haven't used this before, so I'm gonna see if this works.
Melissa,
Yeah.
if you sent your slides to Meenakshi, she can probably project them, and you can ask her to advance them for you.
I did send them, yeah.
So you may want to.
Is that easier to do?
That's what I have done, and that's what I expect to do today.
Yeah, that's better. So you can
That's
focus
better?
on your talk, and you just tell her next slide, and she'll put it up.
Oh, okay.
Meenakshi, would you please do that? Or Atul, whoever is.
Yeah, give me just 1 minute. I will be doing this. Yes.
Yeah, all right. Thank you.
I haven't used this system either. So is it difficult? Like if you press the share button, does it not work? Is that what happens?
I think it's telling me, oops. It was telling me I didn't have permission. I don't know whether I was supposed to grant it permission or not. Well, anyway.
No, your slide's up, Melissa.
Okay, those are my slides. Yeah, I'm not sure, Winifred. I've never been in this system before.
Winifred,
Okay.
if you haven't sent your slides yet, you might want to send them.
I haven't. So which email address do I send it to? Sorry.
The same one from where the link just came. UNESCO
Okay.
chair one. Yeah, just do that. So we'll have time. So Melissa, you can start off now. Thank you.
We need the slides to be
We
shared.
need the
again.
slides.
Yes.
They were up a second ago. I don't know if I did that or you did that.
No, that we are doing it from here.
Okay.
Yeah, here we go.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. I've already been introduced. My talk is going to be about a concept called information precarity, and you'll hear a lot about it because it's the main part of the talk. I'm in the Department of Journalism, and just to note, I'm in the College of Arts, Media, and Communication, which sort of influences some of the work that I do. Next slide. Next slide.
I think there are glitches.
Thank you. I did just want to give a little overview of my work, just because we're so interdisciplinary and where I come from, which will be, it appears fairly significantly different from where you guys come from. And the overall umbrella for my work is participation and communication. 3 different strands in particular. One is about citizen participation in the media. You've heard of citizen journalism, participatory journalism, engagement, ideas like that, where citizens are now producing and have been for quite some time their own news and information. Also related to this is a project I started called the Pop-Up Newsroom that actually, I don't actually work with it anymore, but it has been taken over by somebody in India. And it's a global newsroom where students all report across 24 hours. So it's some of the issues we were talking about with collaborating in these international spaces. The second strand, this is one of the newest strands, is trying to engage non-traditional audiences in news and information through play, games, and creative activities. And this is connected with a project I co-created with artist, a journalistic social practice art project called the Institute for Conspiracy Theory Analysis that produces interventions into conspiracy theories and other forms of misinformation through play and educational activities. And then the final strand that what I'll be talking about today is refugee communications. And I've done field work in this area in Jordan, Denmark, Armenia, and Canada. Can I have the next slide, please? Out of this work, I co-developed with some colleagues this term, information precarity, a condition of instability that refugees experience in accessing news and personal information, potentially leaving them vulnerable to misinformation, stereotyping, rumors that can affect their social and economic capital. And though the definition says the instability that refugees experience, obviously is based on my research and even more broadly, it applies to asylum seekers, forced migrants, IDPs, and internally displaced people, and other vulnerable groups. So that's the core concept that I'm going to be talking about today. It's next slide. So the concept derives from both other prior work people have done, but also from on-the-ground research. And so a kind of building block of this concept is looking first at economic precarity. Many people will say that Bourdieu kind of initiated the use of this term when he was writing about precarité in the mid-20th century labor conditions when the Algerians were under the rule of the French. You saw a great uptick in the use of this term after the 2008 global economic downturn, where many people were experiencing economic precarity in various forms, unemployed, underemployed, underpaid, and abusive work situations, and so on. Around that time, Judith Butler also talked about precarity in terms of it being something that government policies cause economic precarity and other forms of precarity. And they do this through their policies, through militarization, other state processes and oppressions, and that states actually will frequently try to induce precarity. And I've worked with that idea in a paper that was actually just published last month about the state policies around not wanting refugees to come into countries, and that it's an they created a form of induced information precarity. They don't want them to have the precise information on their rights in terms of coming into a country and trying to claim asylum. So they're inducing the economic precarity. The information precarity in the same ways that the states may induce economic precarity. Next slide, please. I also draw on the body of research on social precarity, which is more about connections people have. And Allison talked about social precarity as an evisceration of social ties, connectedness with others, and a sense of security. Interestingly, her work is based on a study of young people in Japan, where they were withdrawing from society and losing all their connections, and they were just staying at home and playing video games and being not social at all, and experiencing great amounts of depression and other problems with that, which I think is an interesting idea to kind of revisit in terms of what's happened during COVID. She also said the social precarity, people feel like they're hopeless. They don't feel like they belong. They don't have a place that they feel safe in. This is something also I've looked at in terms of refugees feeling whether they feel a sense of belonging or not. In particular, I looked at this in Canada, and what is belonging, and how does this get achieved both by them and with others. Susan Banke wrote about precarity, and she actually wrote about it in terms of refugees, and particularly arguing that there is both formal precarity that's created by legal and political systems, and then social precarity by other processes. And then finally, Nicholas Harney was the first person to connect precarity. He was talking about economic and political uncertainties with communications and particularly with mobile phones used by forced migrants in Italy. Next slide, please. So overall, I'm sure this is very familiar to you guys. Ballman, people like this have talked about we're just in a period of constant insecurity in many forms, and affecting most of us in some way or another, whether it's through the environment or through economic situation, inequality, unsafety of your body, your neighborhood, etc. There's also a school of thought that says that these state attempts to kind of protect people from precarity are actually disciplinary systems that try to maintain control and power over people. And we see this in terms of refugees when they're put into camps and detention centers, where there's always an attempt to limit and direct their lives in ways they don't always prefer to go, and in which they don't always agree. Next slide, please. Other people have said, well, yes, there's these bad things associated with precarity, but it could be an opportunity. And one of the opportunities is if you're experiencing some form of precarity, you might recognize it in others. You might realize that it's not just you, it's other people going through this, and in fact, maybe large numbers of people, and it may lead you to behave in a collective way to counter or protest against that precarity. So these sorts of changes they're not planned by the state or an NGO, but people kind of coming together at the grassroots to try to change their precarious situation. Next slide, please. And oops, this is wrong. I didn't edit this slide. I apologize for this. This is the origins of the concept that I came up with, and I apologize for this huge hunk of text. The information precarity kind of developed out of field work in the country of Jordan. I was invited to go there with several other academics, one of whom was a Jordanian national based in Boston. And we got into the camp. We were some of the early researchers to get into this camp, Zatari. It was at one point the second largest refugee camp in the world. It's Syrian refugees who'd come across the border. Jordan is just south of Syria. The camp was about 8 miles from the border, so super close. It had to spring up very, very quickly. People were pouring across the border. Syria and Jordan have very close ties. They have family ties. They have economic ties. People commonly went back and forth across that border all the time before the Civil War. So it was natural that people came across the border seeking some kind of sanctuary. Jordan is known for allowing populations to come in and seek sanctuary. They jokingly referred themselves as the Kingdom of Refugees. So this camp forms, and I don't know if you've all been to refugee camps before, but it's an evolving entity where the camp is marked on the outer rim by the Jordanian military. So they determine who gets in and who gets out. And then a second perimeter of NGOs and the UNHCR, UN Commissioner for High Refugees, sort of administering the camp, administering entities within the camp. What happened in this camp was somewhat unusual. As the refugees, the Syrians are known for being very business oriented, very able to start a business and make some money. And they started a commercial strip. It was nicknamed the Champs-Élysées, and it was full of all these businesses. The NGO folks said they really hadn't seen anything quite like it. They sold everything, washing machines, televisions. There was a pet store, little cafes, all kinds of anything that you might want, you could probably buy somewhere on this strip. There were schools. Some kids went to school. Some kids are just running around. Some kids are working, especially these little, they call them the wheelbarrow boys. There were no taxis or trucks or anything like that in the camp. So they would take these wheelbarrows to haul goods around, and then sometimes people, elderly people, disabled people who couldn't walk around the camps. The camps were a little bit chaotic, and there's no signage. Some people were afraid, especially women. There were shared blocks for showers and toilets, and so refugees rigged up their own makeshift toilets, which was very unsanitary. So it was a place of just insecurity and instability. But one of the things that we discovered when we went there, and two of us were actually at a communication study, so we were interested in what we went in thinking, what apps are they using, or how are they using social media? And what we found is they were tethered to their cell phones, and the cell phone was this item that was so important to them that people would say, I will not eat today because I need to top up my phone. I need it to call my family wherever they were. I needed to try to look for work. I needed to make a doctor's appointment or whatever. So there was this sense that the phone itself was incredibly important. And the phone is as important as food and water is a quote you'll see a lot. Probably some of you have seen that quote. But when we heard it, it was not very common to hear. That has now become something very much associated with this literature. Can I have the next slide, please? So the two of us, especially who were interested in communication, thought that this was a key, and it was an underappreciated key when we would talk to a lot of the people running the camp. We went to a meeting of an organization some of you may be familiar with, CDAC, which is Communicating with Disaster Affected Communities, and this is their argument that we prioritize shelter and food and several other things in that area, but actually communication is something that needs to be prioritized as well. And it's something people often don't always think directly about. And we found this, whether we were in this camp, Zatari, whether we were in the capital, Amman, talking to refugees there, or in the outskirts of Amman in these makeshift informal camps. Unofficial people who refused to live in official camps. Everyone talked about communications. It just came up. It was not prompted. And it became clear to us that it was the center of the refugee experience. Next slide, please. So when thinking about information, and this is how information precarity got developed as a concept, there are two kind of facets that I'm going to address here just for the rest of the talk. And it draws from both our research and then my research in other places, as well as other people's research in this arena. And the two facets that I'm looking at are access and content. Next slide, please. So access can be limited. You can have precarious access because of technological issues. And this can just be a gamut of things, from your cell phone doesn't work in certain places because of who the cellular provider is. In the camp, some people's cell phones continue to work off of someone of the Syrian company because it was so close to the border, but other people had to get a new SIM card that was a Jordanian company. Sometimes it was where you were at in the camp, which company would actually work. Sometimes it was, did you go stand on the one single pile of dirt in this very flat expanse, and you would be high enough to maybe pick up both of them. So technological access was could be very unstable. And this was true, of course, across other research I did with people who left the region and tried to get into Europe. You didn't necessarily have great technological access as you were traveling through Europe, and you were having to make, find wireless where you could, and so on. The other type of access that we found was very impactful was these axes of difference, such as class, gender, and age. And obviously we know class is going to be, you just have access to more resources. It's going to be easier to access information and have technology to access it. Gender was an issue in the camps. We found that the phones were more seen as a male tool. And so even if you were like a 40-year-old mother, the teenage son would be the one who used the phone and would tell the mother, whatever he found out. So they were kind of limiting that. They didn't like, particularly for younger women who were unmarried, to be using the phone. So there were gender differences. And then the biggest difference was age. And these older refugees were not all that great at using the phones, and eventually just became totally dependent on family members or neighbors or somebody they saw in the street asking them information, because they couldn't access it any other way. So their access was the most limited. Next slide, please. So there is sometimes you do see government-induced information precarity, and sometimes the government might set off, and it was in this camp and other detention centers. You see this as well. They may shut down internet access because they think the refugees are planning to do something bad, or they're misbehaving in some way, or they think there's some bad actors who are using phones to coordinate. And sometimes I think it's just a power thing. Sometimes they just shut down electricity to kind of stop people from collecting and gathering. Other technologies that kind of are used to limit refugees' access are things like drone satellites that are flying over the Mediterranean, biometric data and tracking you if you're in a boat or you're on these little rubber rafts or whatever, and trying to get you picked up and sent back. Biometric data that they're collecting when you enter into a lot of the camps, and they're using that to limit, kind of push you in certain directions and to track your movements in various ways, and may tie it to a card that has some money on it that you could buy some food or whatever. Next slide, please. As always, we did try to look for points of resistance. And these are when the refugees, or whoever these vulnerable people are, initiate activities to kind of overcome these problems. In this case, a lot of people ended up sharing phones in ways they wouldn't have when they were at home, with people who didn't have a phone, or people didn't know how to use their phone, wasn't topped up, they couldn't get online, things like that. They began using the phone less as a cellular tool, especially once they leave the region, and more as a wireless tool, which means trying to find places like a train station or some business or McDonald's or something where you could actually access the internet, because they weren't able to afford, or they didn't have a phone that worked with the local cellular system or something. People also used non-digital information as a point of resistance, using flyers, word of mouth, and things like that. Next slide, please. They also, because they were Syrians, they were used to being tracked and constantly surveilled. That was nothing new to them. But they continued some of these same patterns because they didn't know when would the surveillance stop. Would it stop if they were in Jordan? Would it stop if they got to Italy? When would they be free of it? They would remove their phone's battery sometimes to avoid being tracked. Even once they were in places like Europe where they're quote unquote safe, they would use coded language whenever they were talking with anybody back home. It was very common to use various codes to indicate things. And some people, especially during their journey trying to get out of Syria and across other countries, just wouldn't use a phone at all. And some people said they threw their phone away or gave it away. They didn't want to have it on them. Sometimes when you're trying to cross into Europe, the authorities would go through your phone looking for things. And if they found any kind of photos, you really weren't allowed to explain it. Often you were just, sent back or put into some other line and punished for that. And there would be reasons why people would have photos that might appear suspect. Next slide, please. The other kind of point of precarity, information precarity, is the information content. And that's the content aimed at refugees and also information about them. They often couldn't find out things they wanted to know. And even when there was a lot of information available, it wasn't what they wanted to know. And so they became very frustrated, and they would rely on other sources of information, particularly family. And for them, a family group in WhatsApp could be 300 people because they have a different view of family. But what would happen inside of a closed system like that is if a piece of bad information gets into that system, it gets spread among those 300 people who believe it and trust it because it's family. And that kind of information is very difficult to overcome or convince people that it's not accurate. They would turn to quote unquote bad actors, which is a kind of a contested category of whether it's bad or not for these folks. Who would supply them with information, and they may be the only source of information for some of them about how do I get out of Turkey and get to Europe. But again, smugglers, some of them were bad, and they would provide wrong or bad information. They couldn't care less. Some of them, they just wanted to get some money themselves and get you to pay them, or they were under the thumb of some other person above them. The situation was kind of complicated. Next slide, please. The other thing with the refugees is they were often the objects of negative or distorted information produced by the news, on social media, and other sources. This matters because that information affects people's opinions of them. And if the public is being told that they're dangerous, they're terrorists, they're diseased, or so forth, they're not going to want them to come into the country. And that's true wherever refugees are. In some cases, the stereotyping helps fan the flames of physical violence, even against the refugees, especially among these white supremacist groups in Europe. And they may act out against them in some life-threatening ways. And then social media itself, just as we know, increases the use of the spreading of misinformation. Next slide, please. So again, points of resistance. Well, refugees, because they have their phones, they can put out their own version of a story now. Maybe it's not going to be able to counter Fox News, but at least they have a way of getting out some other message. And many refugees, especially younger ones, were very interested in any projects that allowed them to develop their public voice and project it into public spaces. Refugees didn't all just accept whatever information they were given by any source. There were refugees who were very savvy and triangulated information and were double check across multiple range of sources. And Kuhn Lures, who's does a lot of refugee work, says that they were exercising their communication rights from the margin, which I think is a lovely way of putting it. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, being subjected to uncertain information environments pushes refugees to resist representations and make their own media content. Resistance actually may be through collaborating with others, and I find that to be one of the more interesting findings, is people who might not have worked with each other begin to work with each other. They may work with other refugees, even refugees who they would not have interacted with for a range of reasons in their home country. They become collaborators in these other spaces and collaborating with other grassroots people, organizations and volunteers and so forth. Sometimes traditional roles were challenged. The youth were the ones who were able to identify solutions to information precarity. They're just much more fluid with the phones. Women and younger, especially younger women, may be empowered through information actions to generate greater social capital. And we saw over and over again that younger women who were had access to certain programs in the camps became very adept at using the social media, using their phones, and so on. Next slide. And in conclusion, while information precarity can be destabilizing and sometimes dangerous, it's also the experiencing of it can lead refugees to become more adept at making their way toward greater control of their information environment and hopefully over their lives and their futures. And that's the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Wall, for that talk, something which reflected your experience working with refugee camps in Jordan. Thank you so much. We open this up for questions and comments or responses.
So I had just one comment.
Yes,
and
please,
that
Professor.
was,
Please go ahead.
that was all that you said rang so many bells with our condition in India today. Because I do not know whether you've read about this, but in the past week, we've had a burst of misinformation which has led to migrant workers feeling threatened in the places where they work. And then they fled, or it was said that they fled back to their home states and home cities and towns. And then it was all discovered to be misinformation. So yeah, all that you said chimed with us.
Scott?
Oh, hi. Thank you very much, Melissa. It seems to me that in some ways we're working along parallel lines in the area of vulnerability communication studies. A lot of what interests me, and I think Pramod also writes on this subject, basically what are the strategies for exercising communication in the context of precarity. Although I may be talking about literary expression rather than citizen communication by way of various technological devices, I think there's an overlap in this communication area. I'm very interested in this idea of people who are relatively disempowered in highly vulnerable and marginal circumstances, and struggling to control information about themselves and about their predicament. I'm wondering at what point empowerment might occur, though. I mean, you suggested that people feel vulnerable and are very wary in their use of mobile phones and other devices, even after they're in relatively safe circumstances. But recently, I've been working with people from Tigray, Ethiopia, who are outside of the conflict zone. Sometimes these are family members who left before the current civil war in Ethiopia, and they are relatively secure and empowered, and they're trying to glean information from relatives who are back in either refugee camps in Sudan or actually still in Tigray, and then the relatively secure family members assume control of the information and are working to bring this to the light of day and try to gather support for their family members back in more difficult circumstances. I'm wondering if you have a sense of the gradations of precarity, how there might be acute precarity when people are in the refugee camps, and then either when they themselves leave or when they get their information to other people they know who are in different circumstances, there's a certain sense of greater empowerment in controlling that information and using it to mobilize support or for other purposes?
That's a great question and observation and example. And I think one of the things that I'm working on long term, and that has been suggested to me, is to develop a kind of high, medium, and low. I'm a qualitative researcher, so I'm not a person who measures things so much. And so I want to kind of thread the needle with that and not turn it into something where I have to have these precise measurements and things, but to do high, medium, and low. And I did at one point was trying to track it in terms of where they were in the process, because obviously the movement, the journey process, you're having high, I think you still have high information precarity within the camps for a variety of reasons, but also in the journey, you're having generally high information precarity. Only a handful of people that I talked to were fairly well able to access information. And these were almost always people from a higher income and were highly educated with at least a bachelor's or higher. So I think some of your forms of precarity follow you, not just information precarity, because they're interrelated with your social status, your economic status. So when people would get into like Denmark or into Canada, who does better are people who speak English, because they're able to communicate right away so they can get more information. But I also found cases where people were not well educated, in Canada in particular, not very well educated, but they were very open-minded and also seemed to track with having a very egalitarian marriage for some reason, I guess because they were able to help each other. So it's what I'm trying to get at is it's kind of hard to predict. You can say it's more so here or here or here, but when you get into these safe spaces like you've described, some people are going to continue helping folks back home. In some cases in Denmark, there was a Kurdish community. So Kurds who came in, they were able to access more information because of that pre-existing community, whereas other folks didn't have that community in Denmark. And they came to Denmark specifically, whereas other people were trying to get into Sweden. And I don't know if you remember, the Scandinavian countries started saying, no, you can't come in. And then they stopped and they're like, well, we're in this Denmark, here we are. So your pre-existing conditions, and then sometimes it's just random where you're at, who's willing to help you, things like that. But the gradations and at what point you get empowerment, I don't know that it's a straight line. I think people's situations go up and down.
And what you said about encountering a pre-existing community of countrymen from the place where you came from seems in line with my limited experience with Tigrayans. The people who orchestrated the event I participated in several weeks ago related to Tigray and the current crisis there happened to be Tigrayan exiles in Zurich, Switzerland, where there's a very strong group of people, and they, as I say, they orchestrated this event. They brought in scholars and journalists and other people who knew something about the on the ground situation. But these people were relatively safe and secure because they had often been in Switzerland for some time, and they felt quite stable and yet desperate to help their family members who were back in what has now become a civil war in that part of Ethiopia.
And that community is known. The Tigrayans are. I've have colleagues who've looked at them. They're very known for kind of continuing those lines of communication. Where some people leave and they don't want to have any contact. I'm done with that. And I talk to people who are like, I don't want to know. I don't want to hear from anybody. My family. Nothing exists anymore.
Yeah.
There's a researcher, Rana Arafat, who's now I think at London City College. She was did research in Switzerland, but it was also in other parts of Europe about one of the connectors beyond these communities was actually exiled journalist, even if they were citizen journalists or whatever that came out of Syria. She was particularly looking at Syrians, that they formed a network of folks who were sharing information and trying to get it out and also get information in. So I guess some of these will be familial, some of them will be countrymen, and some of them may be based on profession.
Melissa, thank you for that meticulously organized talk and Scott's responses. A couple of things here. One, you said that some forms of precarity you carry with you, no matter where you relocate to. That I thought was particularly interesting for what we want to perhaps pursue. The other is the emphasis. Vulnerability studies and studies of precarity, right from guy standing downwards, seem to emphasize that a lot of this has to do with state policy and state constructions of vulnerable populations. So in your own research, when you spoke about refugees, primarily refugees being the result of state policy or the lack of them, and their use of information and information technology to maybe deal with it, when they bypass or get past the state interventions or modes of constructing them and use the digital media, would they play into the hands of private service providers, which will then engender different forms of precarity itself? Would that happen? Have you found Have you found instances of that you escape from the state policies and state structures which say censor? Because you divided it very neatly between access and content, the two forms that you have isolated. But my point is that when both access and content are determined by private players, private service providers, what kind of precarity does that engender?
Well, we all experience that precarity because of the way that we're tracked and manipulated. I have done earlier research on the Syrian civil war and the citizen journalists there, and what I found was their content was being taken down a lot. Was it too violent, or was there some other reason why they just didn't, the YouTube didn't want it, or whoever didn't want that content up? Or sometimes they would take it down themselves out of fear of being tracked. I know that the Russians were working heavily with the Syrians because they had much better technology to track people and find people and target people within the country. So sometimes these, as you know, these private companies, they both won't protect people and yet also will take other people's content down with sometimes seemingly arbitrary decisions. So no one said to me, oh, now these private companies, they were big fans of WhatsApp or Facebook or whatever site they were using. They may have over trusted some of these ones, WhatsApp, Viber, things like that, to protect their identities and content. I don't know. I don't know if that was being shared or not, but I don't think they were thinking about companies. I mean, companies are behind all of these things happening on our border here in the U.S. and on the Mediterranean. They're parallels, obviously. So one's a desert and one's an ocean, of hiring companies to provide or even to deploy the drones and other high-tech means of keeping people out. I mean, to me, that's a form of precarity, of a denial of your right to even come to the border. That's what we have the problem here, is you don't even have the right to come and ask for asylum in many cases. They're just being pushed back.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Back to Atul, if anybody else. Winnie has it.
Yeah, me next, or Atul, or yeah. Thank you so much. What an incredible presentation. I think it's so important to look at these communities. And now I just want to dig into all your research that you've done. So I hope maybe in the chat you could put some of your links to your work. That would be really amazing. It's so timely for me personally also, because just this week in my class, I had a speaker come talking on refugees in Jordan. And I don't know if it was the same camp or a different one. I would totally want to put you in touch with her. Her name is Najat Kachwa. She's a Palestinian Israeli, but she lives now in St. Louis in my where I am at the moment. And so many of the similar, themes were coming up. The talk she gave this week wasn't specifically on technology, but for instance, we were talking about, will these refugees ever be able to leave the camp? And she was saying that many of them have no interest in leaving, that they've just given up. They've had such trauma that they just want to stay, even though the conditions in the camps are so horrendous. And she said there were stories of people who tried to go back home and were abducted by state officials and punished for leaving, for having left. And so there were just so many really incredible stories. Interesting discussions on how, like, most of the refugees are actually outside the camps. They're like in the community, and that's evidently true for most refugee camps around the world. 80% are outside. And then inside you get access to services that you don't outside, but outside you get to work, whereas inside the camp you can't work. So none of that is really a question. But although I do want to put you in touch with her. But anyway, have you heard anything? I saw this piece on BBC, and I think it may have been about the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh. I could be wrong, but about this crazy stuff that TikTok is incentivizing in refugee camps. Did you hear about this?
No, this sounds interesting.
I was wondering if anything was going on in the Jordanian camps too, or other camps. And I'm racking my brain. I was looking at my computer trying to find this article so I could have more details. But it was something like, it has something to do with the TikTok algorithm and, getting more viewers or something, in China, based in China. But they were somehow they were paying middlemen near the camps to go in the camps and then hire at super ridiculously low rates the refugees to basically just be online for hours, 3 hours at a time, doing nothing, like just going like this, like just singing, laughing, whatever. Somehow it benefited the people back working at TikTok in China. I can't remember how. Maybe it was for some charity donation thing. Maybe that's what it was. They had to be online to seek donations from the UK. Anyway, but it just sort of brought to my mind these transnational linkages that through information that get into the camps, like through phones, and how there's exploitation from outside going in. And I imagine even just selling the phones, somebody's profiting from that as well. And I don't know if you wanted to talk anything more about those things.
Well, you reminded me of an example of a woman I interviewed, and a journalist had come in and done these interviews, and it was about prostitution in the camps. Everybody knew who was interviewing, whatever. And then when the story came out, it was a photo of one of their friends. She wasn't doing that work. She wasn't doing any sex work. And she's just some mom. And they didn't have the care to take, they just was like, well, that's a refugee woman. We'll just take her photo. We'll throw it up here with this article. But they found it. So that this idea that you could go in there and report and say whatever you want and nobody's going to know. It's like, well, those refugees, they're going to find, somebody found it. And they actually had people, I think, posting on Facebook about it and kind of calling out that journalists. So they're not isolated at all. They have many connections. They're interacting with people from all these NGOs and volunteers. So there's face-to-face interaction, and they're often online as well. Yes, I believe at the beginning, and I wouldn't doubt this was true anywhere, that Facebook was trying to get in there and see what they could, maybe we'll offer like the Facebook phone or something like that. And then whatever they could do to get their foot in the door, or offer some kind of the cellular access, but it would have to come through the Facebook app somehow if they signed up for it. So they're always looking for opportunities to either hook those folks or to try things out and see how it works, because it's kind of like experimenting on prisoners. These are open air prisons in many ways. And people with very limited resources and no rights, basically. So yeah, the technology can do many things. I am very suspicious of it, and I take it all with a grain of salt. I don't trust these companies at all. I don't think any of them are any good. I don't trust any of them. I do not think they have good motives. There may be individuals working within them that might, but they are money-making machines that are, we've seen they've just contributed to the destruction of our democracy. But if you're a refugee, you're probably, not thinking about that. You're just, I want to get online.
Great, thanks.
We could move to the next one, Atul.
If there are no more responses, I think we could move on to Professor Slovic's talk. I'll be sharing the screen and we'll be changing the slides from here.
Thank you, Atul. Great, thank you. So I'm planning to give an abbreviated version of the talk that I gave a few months ago under the auspices of the Chair in Vulnerability Studies, focusing on environmental vulnerability and the literary imagination. When I refer to the literary imagination, although I may be talking about examples that seem like artistic literature rather than journalism or other modes of communication, essentially what I'll be discussing is ways of making the vulnerability of the non-human world salient to audiences. This is a communication issue, and also I derive some of my thinking from the social sciences and ideas about, what makes information poignant or meaningful, and what can register with an audience as opposed to not reaching an audience effectively. Actually, much of what I say could easily apply to the context of humanitarian crises, humanitarian struggles, such as refugee issues. And the website that I'll gesture toward, which I managed together with several colleagues, called arithmeticofcompassion.org. That website also addresses a lot of humanitarian crises and refugee crises, including the Syrian refugee issue. So the photo here on the first slide is of a longtime colleague of mine, a prominent writer from Washington State in the US named Robert Michael Pyle, looking at a clear-cut logged over forest not far from where he lives. And the issue here for me is, well, how do you write about this? It's clearly a scene of devastation, but how do you make it meaningful, engaging, compelling for audiences? How do you describe all these fallen trees and this basic collapse of an ecosystem? It's very difficult to take such a large-scale situation and to present it in a way that will move an audience. And yet the idea of moving audiences, compelling them to pay attention and to care and possibly to take action is precisely what a number of writers and other kinds of communicators do in the environmental context. I'm going to focus on writing in my remarks today. Next slide, please. So the human mind, I'll just read this because it's fairly succinct. The human mind has limited ability to embrace the meaning of ecosystemic vulnerability, large-scale vulnerability, but immense capacity to appreciate the frailty of individual non-human organisms, just as we have our minds have immense capacity to appreciate the frailty and the precarity of individual human organisms. And these non-human organisms exhibit precarity akin to our own. Even in humanly strong and durable natural beings, such as whales, primates, and redwood trees, are legible to us. We can understand them as fellow vulnerables, individual, mortal, and representative of species susceptible to extinction. Such psychological tendencies as empathetic self-projection and self-erasure, that means to imagine oneself in the circumstances of another, or to erase the self in order to identify with another, and also a kind of metaphorical emulation to think of the other as a metaphor of self, which is what autobiographical scholars sometimes say. These are aspects of what social scientists and literary scholars have called the arithmetic of compassion, which is the title of the website I just referred to. Key ideas to keep in mind in communicating vulnerability through literature and art are the power of singularity. Even when conveying the vulnerability of a large group, the singular is much more salient and resonant and meaningful than just data or other ways of describing a larger group. The importance of identifying with the victim, seeing oneself in the circumstances of the victim of vulnerability. The victim, and I realize the word victim may seem problematic because it disempowers the subjectivity and agency of a person in vulnerable circumstances. But when writing about some being that is subjected to circumstances that create vulnerability, to use the idea of victimization is often a very compelling rhetorical strategy and artistic strategy. But the innocence of that individual, or lack of control of the situation resulting in harm, is particularly powerful in compelling an audience to care about that individual. And then also the direness of the potential harm is quite important in compelling the attention of an audience. And psychologists refer to this as mortality salience. When life and death situations are in play, audiences tend to be particularly attuned and attentive. Next slide. So I actually started thinking of the ideas related to communicating environmental issues in terms of precarity when I began reading Pramod Nayar's work. First, his book on Bhopal's ecological Gothic, which focuses largely on the human precarity as a result of the 1984 industrial disaster in southern India, in Bhopal, and the development of a Gothic aesthetic element in the tradition of Bhopal literature and art, and the use of the Gothic as a way of conveying the ongoing impacts of the Bhopal disaster, but also as a fascinating area for analyzing textual communications, to see how a particular type of aesthetic had a special power in conveying these damaging effects. Next slide. And Professor Nayar moved on from that 2017 book about Bhopal to publish this other book in 2019, expanding the context to the environmental context. This book is Eco-Precarity, Vulnerable Lives in Literature and Culture, thinking of the vulnerability of non-human beings and of the planet itself. The contingent nature of the earth is what he describes here. Next slide. And this is an example from the earlier book, Bhopal's Ecological Gothic, of this type of rhetorical analysis of a text conveying the vulnerability of a child who was subject to this, I guess I would call it both an industrial and an environmental disaster, not caused by nature, caused by humans, but it affected the environment in which people were living. So it has an environmental element to it. And the way Professor Nayar analyzes the hand brushing the dirt off the face of a child who's being buried following his death caused by the disaster. This style of analysis is related to what I will try to do with some examples of literary representation of environmental vulnerability. Next slide. So my father, the psychologist Paul Slovic, and I began doing a lot of this work together when we worked on a book called Numbers and Nerves, Information, Emotion, and Meaning in a World of Data, published in 2015, which combines a lot of psychological research on different cognitive paradigms identified through empirical research that produce insensitivity to information. So I'm interested also in vulnerability and information studies, but from a psychological and an artistic perspective. And so we, in this book project, identified various psychological patterns or conditions, and then applied them to a variety of circumstances in humanitarian and environmental crises, and looked at communication strategies that seem to have certain effectiveness in overcoming intrinsic human psychological insensitivities to information about vulnerable beings, human and otherwise. And then we, out of the book project, developed the website arithmeticofcompassion.org, in which we summarize some of the psychological and environmental humanities ideas that are relevant, and then have an extensive blog section applying these ideas to contemporary circumstances of environmental and humanitarian crises, including the Syrian refugee crisis. Next slide. Yeah, so here you see that we're interested in the psychology of human sensitivity and insensitivity to information and relevant concepts and methodologies from the environmental humanities, such as slow violence, narrative empathy, and empirical eco-criticism, how you can study audiences' responses to certain texts empirically in order to determine how particular discursive or rhetorical techniques have different types of impacts on audiences. So this is a little bit different than what you heard from Melissa, focusing on the use of communication strategies by citizen journalists. Instead, this has to do more what I'm talking about, the way other communicators who get wind of information about crises of various kinds might use their skills as communicators in order to convey this information to a variety of audiences. Next slide. So some of the key psychological paradigms related to insensitivity to information are psychic numbing, pseudo-inefficacy, the prominence effect, and so forth. I'm not going to go into all these in detail. I'm primarily, for this talk, thinking about psychic numbing, a concept that was first developed by Robert J. Lifton in the context of the atomic bombings in Japan at the end of World War II. And he found that at that time, local citizens were numbed by the overwhelming experience of these devastating nuclear weapons, and the numbing was a survival mechanism. It enabled them to continue with their lives in the face of this utter catastrophe that they were living through. But in more recent years, Lifton and others have found that psychic numbing occurs in the context of information. We feel ourselves overwhelmed by the information we accumulate about various types of events happening in the world, from gun violence and toxic chemical spills to refugee crises nearby or far away, and global warming and a lot of other phenomena which we learn about by way of technical information and numerical data. We quickly lose our sensitivity to that because the human mind is tragically insensitive to large-scale phenomena. Next slide. So you would think in a rational way that every life is of equal value. And so if you're thinking about how we should value human lives or non-human lives, there should either be a linear correspondence between numbers of lives and the values of these lives. One life is worth 2 units, 2 lives is worth 2 units, and so forth. Or the greater the number of lives at risk, the greater the number of vulnerable lives, we could say, the more important they become, because we face the risk of entire communities of human beings or honeybees. In the case of honeybees, when an entire colony of bees faces what they call critical colony collapse, an entire agricultural system may be at risk. So you might have an exponential curve upward if you're rationally analyzing the meaning of lives at risk. Next slide. The reality, though, is that the way we respond to information psychologically or cognitively, we quickly lose our ability to care, to be sensitive to numbers when the numbers increase from 1 to 2. By the time we're talking about 10 lives, 100 lives, 100,000 lives, every individual life has almost no meaning. It's that first life at risk that we're really attentive to. This is called by the psychologists psychophysical numbing. Next slide. Or in fact, what people have studied empirically is that there may even be a collapse of compassion as we move from 1 to 2 until when we're talking about large numbers of lives, again, human lives or non-human lives, we eventually reach a point where the individual lives are almost meaningless to us, where we don't value them at all, and we're not inclined to act when we receive data about all the people who are at risk or all the other lives or ecosystems that are at risk. Next slide. So how do we overcome these intrinsic psychological tendencies? By communicating. Actually, it looks like we may be showing an earlier version of my PowerPoint, not the one that I sent this morning where I tried to abbreviate this, but I'll try to work with this as well as I can. So communicating multidimensionally with images, narratives, personalizing stories and faces, and also to a certain extent, if we understand the psychological processes by which we as humans respond to information, we can push back somewhat against these tendencies toward insensitivity. Next slide. So actually, I don't want to talk about Annie Dillard in this particular talk because that's a little bit of a digression from the more focused presentation I'd like to give. So let's skip through several of these slides related to Annie Dillard. Atul, could we do that? Next slide. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so, oh, sorry, let's go back to the previous one. So I'm interested in how we grasp and communicate vulnerability of non-human phenomena, such as, quote unquote, the environment. In light of what I've just said, we're likely to have very little compassion for something called the environment, something like that logged landscape in my opening slide. How do we move ourselves to care about all of those trees that have been cut down and left to rot on that landscape? We're much more likely to care about an individual organism of another species, such as here we have these human hands reaching toward a whale, an individual whale. We might not care in the abstract about an entire species of whales, but we can be deeply moved by the potential predicament of an individual whale. Next slide. So, as I mentioned earlier, some of the key ideas in conveying the vulnerability of non-human phenomena might include the power of singularity, the power of the individual when conveying even the vulnerability of a large group, the importance of identifying with the victim, personification, and anthropomorphism. Normally, these are considered, or at one time, these were considered communication flaws. If you were to personify something that's obviously non-human, you were distorting its existence and kind of falsely giving it human characteristics. And yet, in order to help audiences identify with a vulnerable being, personification and anthropomorphism are extremely potent strategies and actually quite necessary. And then number 3, representing the victim's innocence or lack of control of the situation resulting in harm or potential harm. This idea of innocence, not being complicit with the circumstances that result in victimization, is a very potent rhetorical strategy. And it's not just a rhetorical strategy in a manipulative sense, but actually a powerful style of communication in order to compel readers, viewers, listeners to care. And then finally, the direness of the potential harm is related to the if someone's very existence or a species' very existence is at risk, this raises the stakes and compels audiences to pay more attention. Next slide. So many of these elements exist in the work of a very interesting Canadian doctoral student named Amy Donovan, who experiments with language that communicates the vulnerability of whales. This is the project she's working on as a PhD thesis at McGill University in anthropology, and focusing on trans-species empathy and how to communicate that empathy. This is a student, although she's an anthropologist, she also has a background in creative writing, and she uses a variety of multidimensional techniques in order to convey the predicament of right whales in the northern seas that are exposed to the effects of petroleum exploration in these oceans. So in a recent book, 2022 book called Cold Water Oil, she has a very fascinating essay called Raw, Dense, and Loud, a whale's perspective on cold water energy. Next slide. And in this article demonstrates what I referred to earlier as the multidimensional strategies for communicating environmental vulnerability. These strategies include fictional or speculative narrative, like how might the whale actually be experiencing the technologies of petroleum exploration, the wires and the noises and things like that. Neuroscience, cetology, literary criticism, and petroleum engineering are among the techniques used in different passages, different sections of this essay. So the opening section draws readers immediately into the experience of whales in the northern seas. You can see it's written as if it were fiction, where the anthropologist is actually trying to imagine a young whale, 4-year-old whale, remembering how her mother perished when wrapped up in some of the ropes dangling in the water used by the people searching for oil. Next slide. Next slide, please. The essay opens in the third person, but representing the perspective of an individual young whale thinking about her mother becoming entangled. So here you see 4 years old, dangling it from the fronds. There's something heavy and dense. These are human-made ropes and wires, not the kelp fronds that whales would normally encounter in a natural environment. And so we are immediately drawn into the experience of this young whale, and then the mourning of the whale after the mother is drowned because of this entanglement. Next slide. So I reached out to Amy Donovan and interviewed her for the Arithmetic of Compassion website that I've mentioned, trying to get a sense of the writing techniques that she uses. And this is, I think most of us on this call right now in this session are academics, and we may be trained to use formal communication strategies, formal discourse within our disciplines. Donovan is experimenting with kind of new modes of academic discourse that break out of a kind of traditional expected objectivity. She says she tries for a tangible crackle, lively, material, interactive, a language that goes beyond what we're normally trained to do in academic work. Next slide. And I think, as she expresses in this interview, we have in this article a particularly acute and powerful explanation of the process of feeling and articulating trans-species empathy toward vulnerable non-human beings, what we might call ecological empathy. And a big part of what Donovan does, as she says here in the quotation, is to step back, step away from herself. This is what I meant earlier by self-erasure, so that someone else can emerge, to try to put herself in the place of the whale. She says, I try to become the whale. I spend time by the ocean. I listen to whale sounds, and I write what comes to me through all this, and edit and cross-check and keep going like that until it feels like there are no obvious inaccuracies. And more importantly, like there's a coherent self on the page, like there's someone with whom readers can interact. So she literally tries to become the vulnerable being that she's representing, obviously using human language, but attempting to not use the stiff and detached discourse that she might use if she were not going through this process of self-erasure. Next slide. So it's one thing to write about another mammal, such as a whale, even if it's a very large and powerful and ocean-dwelling mammal, very different than ourselves. How do you convey the vulnerability of something like a glacier, which is inorganic? Yes, it's made of water, but wouldn't normally think of it as a living being. And of course, to convey the vulnerability of a glacier is a very important way of communicating the effects of global warming because of all the disappearance of glaciers around the planet. Well, Mary Beth Holloman, an Alaskan writer, attempts to do this in her 2018 poem called How to Grieve a Glacier, in which she personifies the glacier. Even as she says, it's not something you can hold in your arms, that you can't rock it in your arms within a blanket as if it were a baby. And yet she's using language that makes us imagine the glacier as a human infant. The poem personifies the glacier, imagining how difficult it would be to hug the disappearing ice mass. And you can notice the use of singularity. She doesn't write about many glaciers, but one glacier. We can identify with the glacier because she refers to its white face, which is a very unusual way to talk about a glacier, but it humanizes this mass of ice. And also when she refers to its potential oblivion, mortality comes into play. glaciers are not living beings, yet the potential oblivion compels us to care about it because we think of it in terms of our own mortality. Next slide. And the expression of human emotions, such as love and grief, the glacier's lack of control. The glacier did not create the circumstances through which it's disappearing. Humans did this. She says, what our kind has created. So the glacier's lack of control suggests its innocence, and then the repetition of the anthropomorphism, the use of the idea of face, very compelling conclusion of this poem. So this is a brief example of how a very skilled writer might try to convey the vulnerability of not only a non-human, but a non-living natural phenomenon. Next slide. Chimpanzees are not humans, but they are genetically extremely close to human beings. Approximately 99% of a chimpanzee's DNA is the same as human DNA. And yet, chimpanzees are wild animals. They are extraordinarily strong, more physically strong than human beings, and also very precarious, very vulnerable due to the destruction of their habitat and other kinds of treatment by human beings who capture them for experimentation and also as pets and sometimes even as food in certain parts of the world. So an interesting example of trying to convey the vulnerability of primates and particularly chimpanzees is this 1993 book by Dale Peterson in collaboration with the famous primatologist Jane Goodall called Visions of Caliban on chimpanzees and people. And early in the book, Peterson and Goodall describe the physical characteristics of chimpanzees. They're like humans, but they're not like humans. The innate strength of humans is extraordinarily beyond what humans have. Next slide. And yet, the book works toward a presentation of the extreme vulnerability, even to the verge of extinction, of chimpanzees. Next slide, please. So late in the book, there's a passage where Goodall visits a scientific lab where people are doing experiments on chimpanzees. And she walks through the lab and is somewhat shocked by the living situation and the other types of treatment of these very human-like, very sentient, conscious, sensitive animals. And then she sits down with the scientists and she debriefs them after her tour of their lab. And she says, in the second column, I think you all know what I felt in there. This is Jane Goodall speaking. And since you are all decent, compassionate human beings, I assume you feel much the same. I went on to talk a little about wild chimpanzees, their close family lives, the long and carefree childhood, the excitements of social living, about the challenges that chimps must meet, their use of tools, their love of comfort, the rich variety of their diet. So she's summarizing here the presentation that she gave to the scientists after looking at the way they're treating these animals. But here you can see that she was intuitively using a number of the strategies that I've been referring to, particularly identification. She described the chimpanzees in a way that enabled the scientists to identify with these subalterns, these dehumanized beings as laboratory experimental subjects, by showing that actually treating chimpanzees like this is much like treating human beings in the same way. Next slide. And then she tries to empower her readers by writing about this idea that we could actually respond. It's one thing to raise the sensitivity of audiences, to make them care. It's another thing to empower them to respond to the vulnerability that has been conveyed to them. And so Goodall does this by talking about what she calls the just me habit. I'm just one person. I can do nothing. She says, we all suffer from that just meism. We all do. I do. But, if we all took actions and spoke out, we could make a huge difference. This is related to the psychological concept of pseudo-inefficacy that I didn't go into earlier, but it's a big part of the Numbers and Nerves book and the Arithmetic of Compassion website. So the idea is to raise the alertness of audiences through communication, and then to say, now there's the possibility of acting. You have the power. It may be a small amount of power, but when we act collectively, we can really make a difference. Next slide. And I'm reaching the end of my presentation. So the kinds of things that I'm talking about are related. I didn't talk about weasels. That was Annie Dillard section that I skipped over. A lot of this is related to what Rob Nixon, an environmental humanities scholar, writes about in his 2011 book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. And the idea of slow violence is that many of the destructive forces and processes in the planet, both socially and environmentally, many of these occur gradually and out of sight. They are examples of a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, an attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. This concept of slow violence is extremely important in my field, the environmental humanities. It pertains to extinction of species, global climate change, toxic contamination, and so forth. And one of the challenges of slow violence is perceiving that these processes are even occurring. Nixon uses the term apprehension. How do we apprehend what is going on when our physical senses don't allow us to do that? We require communicators, a category of communicators that Nixon calls writer activists. And I would expand his concept to include scholar activists who attempt to help us understand concepts such as slow violence and psychic numbing and the arithmetic of compassion more broadly. This is a form of scholarly engagement in order to help us to communicate more effectively about various types of contexts of vulnerability and precarity. Next slide. And now I'd like to work toward a conclusion by talking about another phenomenon that may seem very different than the human. This is a tree, and the case of Julia Butterfly Hill and her tree sitting experience near the top of a redwood tree in Northern California called Luna, which she writes about in her 2000 book, The Legacy of Luna. And much like what Peterson and Goodall do in their book about chimpanzees, she starts by conveying the inhumanness, the size of these redwood trees and their longevity, which is way beyond a human scale. She writes here early in the book, their trunks were so large that 10 human individuals holding hands would barely wrap around them. So it's very difficult for us to identify with redwood trees, or even specifically with the individual tree called Luna, because of their difference from ourselves. Next slide. But she works toward a personification of this one tree that she lived in for nearly 2 years, personifying the tree, giving it a name, Luna, and showing how she and the tree developed an intimate physical and emotional relationship during this 2-year period of activism. She says that she took off her shoes early on in her tree sitting experience so that she could feel Luna's life force through her bare feet. And thus she truly bonded in a physical sense with this individual tree that represented the larger predicament and vulnerability of the redwood forests in Northern California. Next slide. So I've given you a few of examples. You may get the sense that this could go on and on and on with many examples. of what a few examples here of what psychologists and ecological literary scholars like me refer to as the arithmetic of compassion. Again, focusing on the power of singularity, importance of identifying with the victim, the effectiveness of referring to the victim's innocence or lack of control over the situation resulting in harm, and then emphasizing the direness of the potential harm due to mortality salience. And that's it for my presentation. Thank you. We can close the slideshow.
Alex, I loved your talk. I loved your talk, and I was just completely struck by how many parallels there are between what you're talking about and what we talk about in journalism. In fact, I had a session on humanitarian journalism a few weeks ago, and it's many of these same things of how do you get people to pay attention, the singularity, and all of these same ideas. So, and I find it super interesting. I wanted to ask you if you had ever heard of our mountain lion that just died. We had to be euthanized down here, P22.
I think I have read articles about that particular mountain lion.
Everything you say is what his image became down here. It was super interesting. They had a big memorial for him, and I actually went to it with some friends, and the way different people talked about him, it matches a lot of what you're talking about. But the different ways were actually kind of cultural. So for the Native Americans, it was one way. For people, there's some people in Watts who have a P22 thing. They talked about him in some other way of terms of the authorities are after him and won't let him move around. It was really interesting, and you provide this this means of analysis to look at that. I'm actually going to go back and look at some of the coverage of him and try to apply what you've offered here. It's super helpful. So
Melissa, when I read an article in some news outlet about P22, I found myself fascinated by the name P22 and the fact that there was this, people were so connected to an individual animal given such an unfriendly name. It's a very technical name, but somehow people became familiar with it and overcame the coldness of the name and became fond of P22, which suggests that the act of naming the individual is particularly important regardless of what the name is.
Yeah, it was super interesting. They, of course, they name all the mountain lions that they find, like P49, P whatever, in an attempt not to make you look at them as pets or anthropomorphized or whatever.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter. You can call them. It completely shows that doesn't work once we feel something towards these animals.
That's so interesting. And also the cultural variety or variability in the way individual communities responded to the case of this mountain lion.
Immigrants, they were showing videos of people, and immigrants talked about him as well. See, they won't let us go anywhere either, and they limit where we can. It's just, I was super fascinated that happened, that all these different people were able to project them. So I think that it's a great model for environmental writing.
Fascinating.
So I'll shut up, but I love this Amy Donovan's work. I was actually taking notes in this idea of trying to find new ways of presenting our work and talking about these very difficult issues. And so I'm going to definitely look her up.
Yeah, I think she hasn't published a lot, but she will, I imagine, in the not too distant future. But this one article from the book Cold Water Oil is available, and I can send a PDF if you can't track it down.
I would, yeah, love to get that. And this kind of thing that she's done, do you see this a lot in your arena, or is she kind of a great outlier?
No, I do see it. I think in some ways she's sort of crystallizing the efforts that environmental writers have been working on for many years. Writers like Barry Lopez have long attempted to use this sort of multidimensional prose, but not in quite the self-conscious way that I see Amy Donovan using to convey the vulnerability of an endangered organism. And the Lopez's chapter on whales in the book Arctic Dreams, National Book Award winning dream from 1986, uses many of these different strategies for talking about whales, but I don't know that at that point, the entire field of the environmental humanities wasn't as well developed as it is now. And he was kind of groping his way toward different strategies for communicating, and Donovan is benefiting from what many other people are thinking. She works with the anthropologist Eduardo Cohn at McGill, who wrote a book called How to Think Like a Forest, and based on his work in Central America, working with tribal communities and their notion that forests are alive. Forests actually do think and have a kind of sentience and identity, but so that he's one of her advisors. So Amy Donovan, I think, is a really good example of an up-and-coming generation of environmental communicators who are attuned to how to use all the resources they have available to them to convey vulnerability and lead their readers to engage with situations that require some response. I was going to say also in connection to journalism, this is a book from 1999 called Compassion Fatigue. Do you know this one?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah. So this also is sort of an earlier foundational work that may have been done without a lot of the empirical social science research on the way the human mind does actually react differently to individuals versus larger scale communication. But so this idea has been around in journalism for some time.
Nicholas Kristof some years ago wrote a column, and I still assign it sometimes to students, and it draws on this idea of the singularity, and he uses specific examples from, I wrote a story about this and I got all this response, this woman in this bad circumstances in whatever country, and then I wrote a second one about this other one, and the comparison of who got all the letters and people wanting to help versus not wanting to help this other one, and they're both compelling stories, but what people respond to. And I think this kind of information is really helpful to use with my students, because it's not enough to simply cover it. Someone needs to read it and pay attention to it.
We included Nick Kristof's article, The Power of One, in Numbers and Nerves. It's actually in the book Numbers and Nerves. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting, both of you talking about this, that portraying individual cases versus groups, because I don't remember who it was, but somebody wrote about the fact that refugees are always portrayed in large groups, almost as though they are a swarm, a host of things that would be distressing to even look at, forget dealing with. So you give them in the form of an anonymized mass so that they look threatening. And a couple of years ago, I think this essay I had published, and it was, I think, to do with journalism and its coverage of the refugees arriving in Australia. So you show them in large groups, bedraggled, tired looking, not well dressed, emaciated. And this shift from individual faces of victims to masses of victims immediately puts people on guard, and the question of either empathy or compassion therefore doesn't arise. So it was a neat visual rhetoric strategy to blunt the edge of any possible compassion. So since you brought up the Susan Muller work, the early studies of that, I guess it's also not a question of fatigue alone, but the avoidance of compassion, that such a rhetoric seeks to talk about. So I thought it was interesting how you both connect on the idea of singularity versus the mass. Also because of the Donovan piece that you talk about. I mean, yes, we can talk about one whale as a victim, and then you think of a large group of whales. It's almost impossible. And Butler speaks about the difference between apprehension and comprehension. So it's just something like that. I mean, the whale is in and of itself a very large creature, and then you think of a group of whales. How does one even begin to think about this? It's a bit like the hyperobjects argument, so I thought that was an interesting point of connect between you two. Thank you very much, Scott, as always, for thrilling us with this.
Thank you.
Yeah, can I add a little comment? And I hope you can hear me. There's noise outside here, but oh my gosh, so many things that I liked about this discussion. I actually totally agree. I think that empathizing and understanding the ecology is going to be absolutely key to our survival as a species. And I personally, I hope I don't sound weird by saying this, but I cannot wait until we can figure out what whales are saying, because whales have been on the planet for 45 million years and they have survived. How did they survive that long? They must be so super intelligent. And likewise, trees have, basically our planet is, the trees on the planet, not us. They have been around for 1 billion years or whatever, and they talk to each other. They talk to each other through their roots. And you know, that image you gave of the protester who is like using her feet to talk, try to talk to the, yes, we need to talk to the trees. We need to find out how they communicate, how they survive millions of years. I mean, it's, yeah, I'm totally on board.
Winnie, Richard Powers' novel, The Overstory, does that. The Overstory. I don't think it's a hyphenated. I think it's a single word. But there's a lot of stuff which Kohn talks about in How to Think Like a Forest. Exactly what you're saying, the question of empathizing with trees as opposed to empathizing with animals. It's a longish novel, but I think it's worth a read.
Yeah. Yeah, so a lot of these themes, they remind me, I have a sort of history in feminist science and technology studies, of like the first class I took at Berkeley was with Evelyn Fox Keller. Do you know Evelyn Fox Keller?
Yes.
So like a feeling for the organism, like all these feminist scholars were talking about how there's like a different way of doing science, of like, empathizing with what you're studying rather than like, trying to control it. And I think that could be informative for what you're talking about, especially since a lot of the folks that you were sort of bringing up are women, right? So I don't think that's a coincidence. I think, there has something to do with how women are socialized for empathy that sort of leads to that. Also, like, connections with Global South movements. I mean, so many environmental movements have been, have much longer historical origins in the Global South and, in places like the US. So like the Chipko movement in India was, involving people like, embracing trees to protect them from devastation, deforestation, and in Brazil and the Amazon. And so, yeah, I think there's connections to make there also. I really love this idea of slow violence. Like in my class, I teach about like slow food movements and like the whole idea of slowing down. I consider myself a slow professor because I write so slowly. But like, then it begs the question, like, what is the speed of our resistance then? Do we need slow resistance? Do we need fast resistance? And then on the topic of resistance, it just reminded me that right now what's happening in Atlanta, where these protesters have, occupied a forest area that the police wants to use to build, a surveillance complex, basically. And they've recently they've been arrested and they've been living like, I think, in trees and things. And Yeah, connections to other movements that are not necessarily like environmental, but definitely tag on in ways. So yeah, those are things I was thinking about. Thank you so much. That was really interesting.
Yeah, actually, the whole idea of the field that I work in is the subfield is called eco-criticism. And one of the books that I did with a couple of my longtime colleagues from India is called Eco-Criticism of the Global South. It's actually a 2-volume series that we published that attempts to really direct the field to thinking about global Southern perspectives on a lot of these issues. So I'm highly attuned to what you're saying. And I don't know that the psychological paradigms that I was discussing are necessarily explicitly at work in some of this research, but I think you're right that we're definitely fellow travelers and we're thinking along the same lines, the same kinds of issues. And so, yeah, very much appreciate that. And what you said earlier about whales and trees is exactly in sync with a lot of the recent scholarship on those subjects. There's a book called Of Orcas and Men, a very new book that focuses precisely on killer whale intelligence and sociality, and really just describes the intricate dimensions of their work, to the extent that it's possible for us to imagine what life is like as an orca, and also a lot of very recent work on trees, much of it coming out of Canada. But I realize we need to save time for Winnie, for you to give your talk, so maybe we should curb this conversation and save it until later.
Okay, yeah, is that a cue for me to start? Let me see if it works. If I try to press this button.
No, we will move the PPT along for you. Okay. You sent your presentation, so Atul will do that for you.
Yeah, it's not working. So
please go ahead. Yes.
Well, while they're pulling it up, first of all, I just want to say thank you to Pramod. I've been a fan for so many years, and the way we met is that I reached out because I love your book so much. Other books, like you've written so many books that like the ones I'm familiar with are not the ones that Scott even mentioned. So because you're so prolific, and I wish I knew your secret, but yeah, and it's just been a joy to interact over the years, and now to actually be in a room with you. And I hope that maybe you can at some point like give us like some little more backstory about how this program on vulnerabilities came about, because it's really super fascinating. I hadn't really thought about it before, and I'm so thrilled to engage with it. So I was asked to talk about vulnerabilities of information, and so it really got me sort of thinking about how do I encounter that term in the kind of work that I do, which is science and technology studies, but labor, gender, human rights kinds of topics. What kind of struck me is that I don't actually think I hear the term vulnerabilities very often in those contexts, which is where you would think you would hear it, where it would be applied. And then it occurred to me where really I've been hearing it a lot lately is in another field I work on, which is cybersecurity. And the cybersecurity folks, both, in the scholarly field and also in popular culture and on the news and media, are really obsessed with this term. Like they are very concerned. And it has to do with they're concerned about the welfare of information. And they're concerned with weaknesses in networks and the risks of outsiders gaining access to those networks, whether those networks are for the state or for corporations or whatever. And so just right there, it occurred to me that I think there's kind of you can see the differential value of what kinds of things are prioritized in society. If sort of the vulnerability of people is not, humans is not that considered that worthy, but the vulnerability of networks is deemed important. So what I want to talk about is where we see discussions of vulnerability in the context of information security and insecurity, and I'm going to give some examples. And some of this parallels, what's been talked about earlier by Melissa. And sorry about the noise outside. I hope you guys aren't hearing that. Okay, so we can go to the next slide, which is where I want to talk about just some concepts. And I think if you're considering information and the sort of sources of vulnerability, really you need to talk about the changing role of information in society. And I apologize if this is repeat for folks. Can I get this next slide? Yeah, there we go. So really what scholars have been talking about lately is the sort of increasing scope of information collection and the consolidation of power over who is controlling data. You can go to the next slide. One of the influential works on this is Shoshana Zuboff, who has written about surveillance capitalism. Next slide. Yes, thank you. And so she's arguing that fundamental changes in our society are reflective of concentrations of wealth and power by industries for the purpose of surveillance. So firms like, Google and Microsoft and Facebook are like now the new elite, and their dominance is driven largely by their business ventures in surveillance of the public. So humans are now the raw materials from which information is extracted and used for prediction analysis, sales, and profit. There's another kind of concentration of power I want to talk about, though, which has to do with obscurity and asymmetries of being obscure. And this, I want to thank, a couple of members of my group that I mentioned that I run. It's called Labor Tech Research Network. I'd love you all to join if you'd like to join. But we were just having a conversation a couple of weeks ago with Marcin Zarad, who's from Poland, and Anish, who's at University of Oregon. And they were having this conversation, which was really struck me, where they were saying we're in a moment now of widening gap of obscurity in terms of who gets to be hidden and who gets to be seen, who has to be seen, who's subject to being seen. So the state is becoming more and more obscure and opaque in its activities, while citizens are becoming perfectly visible. So an example of the former is some of my colleagues in a book series that I run for MIT Press called Labor and Technology, and they're doing a book on job security, and noting how if you use Google Satellite doesn't let you see certain spots on land that are, sites of, especially U.S. elites like Department of Defense. And these are like blurred out to, they get privacy. They get to be unseen, members of the state. While on the other hand, there is a magnification of the surveillance of the public as individuals, which is done really with partnerships with industry. And you can go to the next slide for this one. And an example is with when you look at the U.S. Department of Defense and their division called, ICE, which is, it's the Border Patrolling Division. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. This group, Gente, they did this incredible analysis of like, who controls that border patrolling apparatus of the state, how is it enabled to be run? And if you trace the origins back there down through the diagram, you'll see that at the bottom is Amazon, like Amazon.com, which is really bizarre. But the hidden infrastructure behind state surveillance is this company, which we think of as a sales company. It's like online retail is what we think of it as. But they have a division that's selling cloud storage space. And that cloud storage space division is actually more profitable than their sales division. Technically, and I don't know what the terms are, like it's like through net profits or something like this. But what they do in selling this space to the government is that the Department of Defense collects data from the public, massive amounts of data, massive, and they store it online there. So this is like, credit card readers and like license plate readers when people are crossing the border, and immigration documents and biometric data, eye scan data. All of this data is now, being held on these Amazon servers and others. So these are just some examples of the way people are becoming more and more visible. Next slide. One thing I wanted to sort of bring attention to that really struck me as odd when I was, engaging this conversation with my colleagues, is that they were talking about a new trend, which they call the commodification of vulnerability. They said that if you look at these fields of information economies, cybersecurity, what is being sold now in the market, what's being traded, what you can buy, is access to the vulnerabilities of others. And it happens in three kinds of ways that I was thinking about. And by the way, this is all just me sort of ruminating on the topic, so it's a first sort of stab at thinking about it. But the first one, you can hit the arrow key again. It's gonna do, yeah, there you go. Is that you can buy online researchers, investigators who are going to investigate and disclose vulnerabilities in networks. Like that's the whole industry, is finding these vulnerabilities. And some of this, you can hit arrow again, is illicit, it's illegal. So, this is like when you go to the dark web and then you can hire someone to like find or even create vulnerabilities in systems, like backdoors into networks and things like this. And another way you can do it is a legal way. And this is what's called ethical hacking, or bug bounty hunters, bug bounty programs. And yeah, if you can press arrow again, yes, illegal again, yeah. Sorry. So these are engineers who are finding vulnerabilities in their own system, in the system of the client, so that they can be, prepared for potential attacks in the future, or repair their own systems. So that's a legal sort of form of this. But in either case, you can, hire someone to like search these vulnerabilities. The next kind of way that there's a commodification, and you can hit arrow again, is the growth of a whole bunch of industries that are cleaning up information, after effects of vulnerabilities. So they like manage the fallout of breaches, which are increasingly common. So this will be professionals that you can hire then for a fee, and they'll repair your, network. They'll fight legal battles for you. They'll solve, whatever information troubles you have. And examples like LifeLock, for instance. So you can buy these services on the market. So this is not like buying vulnerability itself, but it's certainly benefiting off of people who have become vulnerable. And then a last type of commodification, you can hit arrow. Thank you. Is offering digital services to individuals so that they can take advantage of informational vulnerabilities of other members of the public. So it's enabling sort of this sort of use of vulnerability by other parties. And so I'm going to get back to this in a second, and it's especially marginalized groups who are then the target of those attacks, and I'll get back. But anyway, the point is that when vulnerability is commodified, it sort of exacerbates these inequalities of information. It creates incentives for exploitation, and has impacts on who gets to be secure and who doesn't get to be secure. So I want to give a few examples, and I'll try to be quick. You can stop me at any time. Next arrow. So one of them is gender. Oh yeah, this is an example of the bug bounty industry, which is striking growth through 2029. Okay, next one. Gender. Okay, and next one. So this survey by that was funded by the U.S. Department of Justice of domestic abuse shelters found that 97% of occurrence that of gendered types of harassment of these people in shelters is now happening through technology. And so accessing women's online information is a central means of keeping them under control. And here's a list of various ways that it is done. It's by breaking into or accessing online email accounts, or accessing computers, or eavesdropping on their phones, or messages of intimidations and threats. Some of these activities, though, the ones that I'm interested in at this moment here, are the ones that are using those commodified technologies as tools for sort of engaging in the abuse. So I think we can go to the next slide here. So one example is this one that I've been really just sort of in awe of for a while, which is called spoofing, which is where you can change your outgoing phone number, what people see on their caller ID, to be someone else. You spoof your identity. But and now you can do this like with Google Voice on your phone. But these services here, like Spoof Card, will offer other services where you can also disguise your voice. You can change your gender. You can sound older or younger. And again, you can also do a whole bunch of like recording calls and things like this. It's also done through location-based GPS devices. And next slide here. So it's recently been found that AirTags, these are these Apple devices. It's like a little, quarter-size thing that you can put in anything, even someone else's purse or in someone else's car or whatever, and it will track them for you so you can see where they're going. And this has been used by domestic abusers to keep track of where they're going. Next slide. And another example of this, which is not only sold on the market, but involves collusion with the state. So this is legal now, is an app that came up in Saudi Arabia for husbands to not only track, but also control where their wives are traveling. So you can go to the next slide. That's what the app looks like on its face. And when you open it up, there we go. All right, yeah. Just keep going, click 3 times because there are 3 different little images there. Yes, thank you. Yes, I think there's one more. Yes, okay. So this is what it looks like when you're on the app. So, you can select for the person, and then you can see where they're going, and then you can cancel the permission. Or a husband can cancel the permission of their wife to travel, and it will be linked to the state. So these are all examples of how this industry of commodified items is enabling vulnerabilities of certain groups, in this case women. There are many other ways. I mean, I could just go on forever on what is the impact of information of vulnerability, but another really important way is health. Next slide. There's a new book by Mary Abeling. Next slide. On the afterlives of data, and really should say the afterlives of health data because that's her interest here. And she writes about how your data lives on after your death because it is bought and sold by data brokers who just continually are reusing it and reusing it and reusing it. And she found this out because she had a miscarriage, and somehow all these data brokers knew she was pregnant, and then they kept on stalking her with advertisements and emails and things for 5 years afterwards. And so this book is about how your data lives on, your health data, specifically your medical data, lives on in the internet. Next example comes from recently with the U.S. Supreme Court decision on abortion. We started to see how information systems on phones are now tracking women who are seeking abortions. So just by if you look it up on Google or who you're contacting with your phone or whatever for phone calls, all this is now saved and surveilled. And can be used to criminalize women who are seeking abortions where it's not legal. And the last example I want to give has to do with the welfare systems and the poor. And we can go to the next slide. Next slide. So here's a report that came out from the UN General Assembly Rapporteur on human rights. And this report's on extreme poverty and is specifically how it's being exacerbated by the digital welfare state. And he remarks how welfare programs like health, social security entitlements, etc., are a really attractive point of entry for state governments because a large share of their budget is going to those things. And so they've been really applying technologies to try to reduce costs. And instead, what's happening is that these systems are being used to identify, punish, and discipline the poor. And ironically, some of the worst offenders are the systems that are supposedly anti-fraud. They're fraud detection programs. And what those systems do, they're AI-based. They're taking the place of humans who used to make decisions about who's eligible for welfare benefits. They're instead marking the people, low-income families, as fraudsters erroneously. There are tens of thousands of them in one state alone in the US. And then automatically, without human intervention, demanding repayments and garnishing wages and intercepting their tax refunds and bank accounts and such. So all this is happening automatically. So those are just some examples. We're so out of time. You can skip through. I was also going to talk about labor, which is what I study myself, but you can click on it. I'll just go to the end here. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. I can talk about that later if you guys are interested in labor dynamics, which is what I study. But it's okay. Next slide. Next slide. I just want to talk about resistance because I'm so glad that others have been talking about it as well. There are so many initiatives now to resist information and obscurity asymmetries, the ones that I've been talking about here. Next slide. One is a call for data justice movements. Lynette Taylor in UK has been really doing excellent work on this. Another, next slide, is called Abolishing Big Data, and I was involved with this group in UC Irvine a few years ago, where especially regarding policing and racism and the collection of data that criminalizes Black communities, Latino communities. There's been a call to just stop collecting certain kinds of data that are punishing the poor. And then there are calls also, next slide, I'll just end with this one that's, that actually sort of comes full circle and says, let's use vulnerability itself as a means of resistance. And this is a book called The Exploit. If you read it before, it's by Alexander Galloway and Eugene Thacker. And what they argue is that what resistance movements should do is exploit power differentials that are already existing in the system by discovering holes in existing technology and projecting potential change through the holes. And so examples of like the Yes Men or Anonymous of taking down digital infrastructures of empire by exploiting these network, sort of vulnerabilities is a way of sort of, turning the notion of vulnerability on its head for the benefit of, the public rather than the state. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Winnie, for that. One thing that I was struck by in what you were saying, and with Melissa's own talk about Syrian refugees and their, shall we say, reliance on technology. How does humanitarian surveillance work in that case? Since your own work has been on surveillance for some time now, and you spoke about it again today, and how do projects like the Sentinel project, mapping hotspots of violence, work? I understand that and there's work done on how Google Maps constructs hotspots around the world and speaks about endemic violence in such places like Africa and others. But there are also humanitarian projects which seek to, I don't know whether they forestall violence of any kind, but at least they're able to signal that something is likely or about to happen in probabilistic terms. So how does humanitarian surveillance work when it comes to, say, refugees? And this is, again, bringing you into conversation with Melissa's arguments.
Melissa, did you want to address the refugee part of it?
Sure. There's lots of ways that they're surveilled, but I think one of the particular ones is the biometrics, where they're scanning your eye, either so that you can live in the camp, so that you can access health care. They can make it be for anything. And then once they have that information, it would limit your access to resources by you'd have to prove who you were, but also you don't know where that information is going and who they're sharing with security services, clearly, but which ones, and only in that country, internationally, whatever. So that's one of the ways they're doing it. They're also, as I said, using drones and satellites to figure out where you are, to try to turn you back and not even give you a chance to show up at a border. And sending out, in the Mediterranean, they just send out ships from whichever countries that find you and then take you back to Turkey or wherever you were, North Africa, and not even let you get to the places where you could try to claim asylum. So they love their tech, and the U.S. uses all this tech on the border, which is what Winifred was already talking about, and actually shared that wonderful flyer. I just looked it up to share with my students, where it traces it to Amazon.
Yeah, actually, that whole report, they have several reports. They have a great research team, but that's just one graphic there. They have tons of others that are just mind-blowing. Yeah.
And even in some cases, there were in the camps, an NGO would say, here's a card to go get food. It's on this, you'll get the credits or on the card. But then they were selling that data and tracking people and saying how much food and what food were they getting and things like that. So you think they're doing something for you, and maybe they think they're doing something for you. We've all been trained to give up so much to these tech companies that we don't even know what we're giving away half the time.
Yeah, I'll just tag on that. Yeah, you're exactly right, Pramod. I'm very interested in not only humanitarian surveillance, but surveillance. What some have called surveillance is by the subaltern, by the marginalized, against elites. And I have a book coming out where I actually talk about this in a little more complicated way. I don't think there's just two groups. I don't think there's just elites and surveillance and counter surveillance. I don't think that's the way it works. I think actually there's ecosystems of surveillance with multiple parties who are interacting for other reasons, like in my case, through the digital service economy. And they're connected through these economic relations, but then each group is using surveillance for their own purposes. And sometimes those purposes align, and you get partners between different groups who you might not think would be partnering, but they have combined interests. So in my case, you'll have workers in India with consumers in the US who are both interested in surveilling the companies in the US that are linking them together. But then it's sometimes those Indian professionals are interested in aligning with Indian, like the managers are interested in aligning with the Indian workers more than they're interested in aligning with the elites in the US who are hiring them. So that there's many different cases of alignment, but the point is, in terms of resistance, that you have these axes of resistance that happen both from below and across global north and south lines, and they're using surveillance as a tool of asserting their interests. It's actually, I call it a mobilizing surveillance. They're using it, as a tool. It's not only a tool of domination, basically. Yeah.
Thanks very much for your talk, Winnie. I listening to you scroll through the list of data vulnerabilities that all of us experience to some degree or another, some more than others, but really you're simply describing the modern world, and it's it makes us feel. Just hearing you name the different types of vulnerability to which we're all susceptible is really rather unnerving, and yet I found myself wondering a little bit about, particularly in the context of the apps that Saudi women may be subjected to in order to be surveilled by family members, particularly husbands. It made me think about the relationship between voluntary vulnerability and involuntary vulnerability. And I'm thinking of this particularly because I experienced something similar when I was lecturing at the University of the United Arab Emirates a number of years ago. And I was lecturing on the women's campus and having very lively and free intellectual conversations with the women students who were completely veiled. You know, they were, in some sense, they were being controlled in their clothing, but they were in this space of free intellectual activity. And then someone told me, as soon as these women left the campus, their app on their phone would trigger a male relative who would swoop in and pick them up so that they could not be out on the streets by themselves. So they seemed to be making a trade-off. They were allowing themselves to be surveilled as they left the university in order to have the freedom to attend the university and be in this space with other women sharing ideas. So they were voluntarily making themselves vulnerable to an app like the one that you described as a trade-off for another type of liberation that they could achieve as university students. Does that make sense?
I think you're touching on something that's so important, which is like that the line between voluntary and like choice and not choice is really muddled in so many situations. I don't know how much I would call that voluntary in the sense that I don't think they have control over that app. I don't know. What would we'd have to find out, which is so interesting, and I'd love to hear more about it. But you know, it is true. Feminists call this a patriarchal bargain, and that women do it in their daily lives. It's like you trade off one kind of control that you're going to experience by maybe one, you know, form of patriarchal institution for another, just so you can navigate and survive. So I think, yeah, you're exactly hitting on it. There's so many complexities with those issues, though. Like, there's a lot of Middle East, or what they like to call it now, like West Asia feminists who talk about how, like, wearing the veil for some women actually is liberating. Because it frees you from harassment, basically, and other forms of pressure. So I don't think it's quite that black and white, but I love all those examples because it's exactly true. It's like, you know, you have like the spatial control that you described there, but also the technological control and what's agency. And yeah, it was a great example. I love it.
It's a little bit reminding me of women in Egypt and Lebanon, I'm sure other Middle Eastern countries, and in the US and other parts of the world, using mapping of sexual harassment maps, where they were, so kind of the resistance. Always am interested.
Yeah, like Hollaback, I think it's called Hollaback in New York, and there's one in India, I forgot the name of it, where they like are taking pictures of places that they are harassed and people who are harassing them. So that others can avoid those locations or whatever. And actually, my daughter, that was her master's thesis she studied Mexico City, and she did a mapping of sites of harassment and mapped it onto the public train system and showed how the harassment occurs at certain spots on the public train. So yeah, that is a great example.
We have to surveil to protect ourselves in return.
Yeah.
I wondered if you would talk a little bit more about data justice, and are there any powerful entities? I mean, I don't know if the EU is, at least they give them more protection, but any powerful entities working for data justice? Is it all sort of small grassroots groups up against these giant companies?
I would say yes, more and more. I mean, I would say that's the silver lining in this story, is that it's becoming so much more pervasive, and the ways you can see it, for instance, is in the GDPR in the EU, the General Data Protection Regulations. that really put restrictions on US big tech companies and their privacy practices, for instance. And there are other countries who have even better legislation, I believe, parts of the world. There's incredible legal organizations working now to fight these systems. We just had one at my group, Labor Tech. I think it's called Stop Surveillance. They're based in New York. I forgot. The acronym is STOP. But I'm really inspired by, as I study labor, is like the massive like tech industry mobilizations that have gone on in the last few years. That you had Google workers all around the world in the thousands saying, no, we will not build technology for ICE, for Palantir, and so I think you have it from workers, you have it from engineers and computer scientists who are now supporting initiatives for what the acronym FACT, Fair and Accountable Technology. There's a whole bunch of really amazing movements now that are really gaining control. And even Biden now, he has this advisor who is STS scholar, Alondra Nelson, who's working on a Bill of Rights for artificial intelligence. So I see positive things going on. And I hope I didn't take us too much over. Are we over time now, I think?
No, we lost a bit of time at the beginning with the technical glitch, so we are just on schedule as that's wonderful. Yes. So over to Anna for a little formal note.
To say thank you. So thank you so much. All three of you professors taking time out early in the morning for all of you. Difficult times to wake up and then to start talking and discussing this, but I'm very grateful on behalf of the UNESCO chair as well as Atul, Meenakshi, who had to leave because she's just gone to take up a job elsewhere. So all of us together, Sharad, who chipped in, that's Sharadindu Bhattacharya, who chipped in with the link so that we could set this up, and Zahid, who joined us as well. Thank you so much, Professors Poster, Slovic, and Wall. We had a great time. And you've given us a lot to think about, as this is one of our initial moments in the way in which we want to work with this UNESCO chair. Professor Poster asked, what exactly are you going to be doing? So we don't yet have a clear direction. It is, like Pramod said, a teaching and research unit. And we want to have concepts in place in different disciplines, realms, areas, all of which speak of and to vulnerability in today's world. Our focus does have to be a little more to the global south than it is to the developed nations, but we are still working on how we'll take this forward. So this really helped, because even though you all spoke about very specific instances drawn from your research, examples drawn from your research, they still work across nations, areas of the globe. And so this will give us a head start as to how we move forward. Thank you so much once again, all three of you. And I hope maybe if you can spare time, you'll join us next week when we have round 2 of this. It would be great if you could. Thank you.
Thank you, Winnie, Melissa, and Scott, for doing this. We are very, very grateful. It was a delight listening to points of convergence in all your talks. So from orcas and whales in Scott to information and refugee crises. It's been wonderful listening to all of you. Thank you so much, and we look forward to further interactions. We'll let you know once the recordings are up and your texts are up on the website. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a good day, all of you.
Thank you. Have a good day and a good night.
Yes.
Yeah.
Bye. Bye,
Thank you,
everybody.
Sharad and Zaid, Atul, Anna.